Welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show appearing only here on Facebook and the only place where we answer your questions about politics in Africa. I'm Peter Clottey, Shaka Ssali and Paul Ndio are in Zimbabwe covering the elections. Today with me is Ndimyake Mwakalyelye, Chief of the Zimbabwe Service of the Voice of America. Hi Ndimyake, how are you today?
I have the dubious honor, to quote Shaka, of sitting in his chair today, and I just pray that I can channel his facts, not opinions. But thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, thank you. So, for the last 3 weeks, it's been all Zimbabwe in Africa. There are things happening in the rest of Africa, but the focus has been in Zimbabwe. Preliminary assessment by international poll observers show that the elections were peaceful and smooth, they said. Were you expecting that, particularly when previous elections, opposition groups have said there have been intimidation and harassment and all that, but were you expecting it to be peaceful this time around?
Well, I was holding my breath because obviously Zimbabwe has had a historically violent past when it comes to elections, especially around election time. Violence just seems to start finding its way to the surface. The 2008 elections, when President Mugabe and the late MDC leader Morgan Tsvangirai were vying for that seat, is always being used by many Zimbabweans as the mark of how bad things got. And not to say that maybe there's not violence or intimidation, but clearly when people refer to the 2008 atmosphere, the conclusion is that it's much better. It's peaceful. People seem to be able to express themselves the way they genuinely feel. That was clearly not the case in the 2008 time, where there were a lot of visibly soldiers and state security agents, and people literally felt like they were in danger or they were being restricted somehow. So in that respect, there seems to be a lot of consensus on that, even among voters. Many of the voters we've spoken to, of course there are others who contradict, but the majority would tell you that, oh, I felt peace, I felt free, I felt like I was making my choice, you know.
Is it because for the first time former President Robert Gabriel Mugabe is not on the ballot or not voting for himself for the first time since the country gained independence in 1980?
Clearly, a big factor, the omission of the constant way it has come to Zimbabwean elections, the former president, Robert Mugabe. It seems like that's what it's seemingly appearing to be. A lot of people make reference to how it was under him and versus now how it is without him. And the fact that he seemed to have been just the central figure around which everything happened, good or bad. Coincidentally, though, when he was speaking over the weekend, when he called the press conference, he was painting the impression that things are worse now than when he was in office. Right. So it's really a question of, you know, what was happening? How did he directly impact this impression or the atmosphere that some now really feel has been lifted and it's different because of his absence? So it's an interesting time.
Is he angry? Because for the first time he says he will not vote for ZANU-PF presidential candidate. Of course, his former protege, Emmerson Mnangagwa, the president and the leader of the ZANU-PF party.
He's very angry. Not that I've spoken to him personally about it, but judging from the interviews that he's been giving, most recent being this press conference, and then also in the past, because he's given interviews to SABC and some other stations, where he really has stated very flatly that he feels betrayed by the now president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. And I think over the weekend he made reference to the fact that, yes, he will not vote for ZANU-PF because he said it's the party that he led and was part of the founding. And now he's on the outs. And he says, I cannot vote for a party that has put me, to quote him, in the condition that I'm in. So clearly he is not a happy man, and he's declared that he will not vote for ZANU-PF. I think the conversation had been happening whether would he be an asset or liability to ZANU-PF if they chose to approach him and ask him to either endorse his former vice president, who he fired pretty unceremoniously before the coup or before the military intervention, or is it the best thing for ZANU-PF for him not to be involved at all? And then, of course, now he has not said, I will endorse MDC or I'm endorsing MDC. Basically, he just kind of created that impression that if he was going to pick anybody, it would have, of the 23 candidates, that he's thinking that MDC Alliance, led by Nelson Chamisa, is the more likely or the more viable candidate and the more viable party for the country because of, I guess he said it has more to offer than the other parties. And we've been asking people, by the way, so what do you think? Do you think he would have been, you know, the litmus test for how strong ZANU-PF is said to have always been if it had been winning the elections in the past as legitimately as it has been claiming? Or is this something that needed to happen for people to start thinking maybe outside or really thinking about ZANU-PF in a different way? So it's an argument that is ongoing. People still want to know whether Mugabe hurt or helped. But I don't know if you saw the video of him voting yesterday.
I did.
And they were crowds. They were singing and shouting. And then also he did say that depending on the outcome, obviously I'm sure he's pinning on the outcome not being a ZANU-PF, he said then we'll have a chance to meet again. You, me, you, and everybody. This is, I'm paraphrasing what he said. So what does that mean? Does that mean he has a feeling that people still want him and that given the chance, he'll come back, maybe not as president? I believe in an interview that he had with SABC, he was asked that question. And he said, come on, I'm 94. I'm not going to be trying to enter politics. But maybe by that insinuation during the press conference, he wants to play some role. And it's a question of what role would that be, given, of course, who wins the elections?
Now, based on your report, there were speculations of factions within the ZANU-PF, you know, who might support him still. Do you think that could affect the chances of President Emmerson Mnangagwa in this election?
Well, you know, Peter, I remember seeing the video when President Mugabe, he was not physically present at the headquarters when they were having the deliberation about his impeachment. And then everybody was waiting for that resignation or to see what he was going to do. And then the resignation was read by the Speaker of the House. And there was a jubilation, an eruption of joy. And I know I was asking myself, what happened? I thought this was a party that loved this man,
right,
who revered this man. They'd actually endorsed him for the next election.
Right.
So what does that mean? So I guess to answer your question, it leaves a lot more questions than really answers.
On August 4th, technically the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission is supposed to come up with the outcome of the elections.
Yes.
Do you anticipate them coming up before? And what is the sense you're hearing from the ground that who might choke this? Because obviously both President Emmerson Mnangagwa and main challenger Nelson Chamisa have been, you know, saying that they've been doing very well and they were going to win the election.
And they've already declared themselves the winners.
Right.
And they will not accept an outcome other than that. So, well, it's going to be an interesting time. I just finished hearing a press conference that was given by the Zimbabwe Electoral Commission, where they say there will be absolutely no cheating. The polls will be reflective of what the people of Zimbabwe want, which is, I hope, what is going to be the outcome. Now, in terms of the 5th, the August 4th date, well, constitutionally, within 5 days of the completion of the elections, the Zimbabwe Election Commission has to issue the full results. Will it happen earlier? It could be. We're already hearing trickles now of not the presidential election, but parliamentary. You know, this was a harmonized election, so there were three different categories of elections going on. The House of Assembly, the local authority elections, and then, of course, the presidential election. Well, you know, I guess in the spirit of leaving the best for last, I guess that's the one that we'll be hearing last. But I don't think there's anything that prevents them from announcing it sooner. But clearly, the longer the process is delayed, then there are all these speculations which have already started that, wait a minute, are you cooking up things? Is something going on that you're trying to maybe make the ruling party win? And then, of course, also there's already reports coming in. In fact, just before I came to your show, there was some results out of 210 constituencies. The ZEC announced 7, of which 5 went to ZANU-PF, and 2, I believe 1, went to the MDC alliance. So by that indication already, you're hearing, talks of rigging and cooking up numbers, and is this the true reflection? There's a lot of shock in some instances. So I think the longer the process is delayed, I think obviously it will raise the anxiety.
The Electoral Commission came out saying there has been at least 70% voter turnout. What do you think accounted for that high turnout? And there appeared to be excitement among Zimbabweans going to the polls. Some videos going around, you saw an old lady, campaigning on the day of the election, chanting Chamize's name and all that. Right. What caused, or what can you pinpoint as the main ingredient that energized people to come out to vote?
Change. They want change. People say they want change. And they've been waiting for this moment, for a long time. The last election was 2013, and I think, that was just coming at the end of a 5-year unity government with the ZANU-PF and the MDC. And after that, of course, President Mugabe won the election, and then now there was this spell again. And now with him out, and unfortunately the death of Morgan Tsvangirai, the leader of the MDC, also out, there's been this renewed energy. Of course, not to forget the November incident. It was the 14th here in the US, it was the 15th in Zimbabwe, when the tankers came out and they surrounded the ZBC, and then they made this announcement that we're in charge. And then ever since then, now what you keep hearing in Zimbabwe about this new dispensation, I'm sure you've heard that saying all over the place. So even in Zimbabwe, people are talking about now after the new dispensation. So it seems almost like the page was this way today, and then it flipped, and now it's a completely different page. Right. And apparently we are starting from scratch. So people have this sense that we are starting from scratch, and we can actually make Zimbabwe the way we want it. So I see in my perspective this sense of a better Zimbabwe, and people feeling that they've got a role to play and that they want to play it. And then you remember also there are thousands and millions of Zimbabweans outside Zimbabwe who now see the power of the vote. And obviously that's trickling down too. People understand that, when there's an election, show up, put your name in, put your ballot in there, see what it does. And you can actually make a difference. So I think that sense of participation, that sense of being involved, that sense that my vote counts is maybe also resonating. People feel that, yes, it will matter, and it will happen, and then my role now is just to do it. So even when they were doing the voter registration drive, people were coming out, people were turning out, and there was a lot of involvement and interest, and people trying to catch the deadline, because there was a window during which you had to have submitted your interest, I guess, registration formally. So I guess by that participation, that level of participation, you want to believe that, 5.6 million plus people registered to vote. And, it's less than the last election, but still pretty high. And the majority of them being youth, under 35. So clearly there's a stake here for the youth, and also for those who don't feel they've had the Zimbabwe that they fought for or they dreamt of following its independence in 1980.
But 23 presidential candidates with 5.6 million prospective voters. Some people are saying the candidates were too many, and that the opposition groups had one sole aim to get rid of the ZANU-PF. So why didn't they come together as a united front, get rid of ZANU-PF, they can settle their differences later? What happened?
Now, Peter, the first time without President Mugabe, in 38 years, this is your chance. If you're anybody out there with a presidential aspiration to actually run for president, I don't think at that point somebody's maybe thinking that, wait a minute, let me, form this coalition. People are thinking, now I have a chance, because it's been absolutely impossible within the last chunk of time. So I think the 23 serves several reasons. One, it explains that there's a desire for people to put their, I guess, method of empowering the country to test. And then there's this sense of democracy at its best, you know? Hey, 23 candidates, meaning that they qualified through the nomination process and they went through whatever system and process they had to go through and they made it. Is it a serious candidate? Is it a non-serious candidate? Look, they all feel, you speak to even whoever you might determine to be the least capable of running the country or no chances of winning the election, will tell you, I'm going to win by 99.9%. So hey, let dreamers dream and let this thing happen as is happening. So people on the ballot box, on the ballot paper, have a choice of 23. Of course, only 22 are running because one pulled out. But of those, just that fact that you're on that ballot paper, I guess that's historical, right? I can frame it up, put it on a nice wall and say, I did it.
But do you see a possible runoff, looking at how many they are, or do you think the ZANU-PF could chalk it based on some of things that President Emmerson Mnangagwa has been able to do, opening the country, people feeling that things have changed? Or Nelson Chamisa, who is a 40-year-old preacher, former spokesman for for MDC, now a prominent lawyer and all that. Do you think there could be a runoff or, well, just a first round?
So, of course, it's a lot of speculation. There have been some surveys that have been done that have given both scenarios. One, victory by Mnangagwa, a victory by Chamisa, but with not 50 plus 1. So 50 plus 1 is the measure for you to win outright without the need for a runoff. So in the event that nobody wins 50 plus 1, absolutely there's going to be a runoff. Judging from, you know, even though, as you said, there are 23 candidates, it's really been, by many measures, a two-man race, these two candidates, based on the turnout at their campaigns. You have literally seas of people. I mean, you can see far and wide, there's either red, the MDC Alliance, or there's some yellow and green and red representing ZANU-PF. So it's very likely that there's going to be a runoff. And then if there is a runoff, that I believe will be in September 9th. It's already been provided for in the expectations of if that eventuality happens. But the predictions are, you know, anybody's guess. But the truth is, I guess we should know.
Before we go to the questions from the viewers, you've heard speculations about ballot stuffing, voter irregularities here and there. How credible are some of these speculations? And will these parties be compiling them to possibly go to court if they feel aggrieved about the outcome of the elections?
Absolutely. You know, these speculations and theories about stuffing of ballots and, you know, additional boxes showing up here and there, they're true to a point in terms of what people say they've seen, you know, and in many countries, it's not just Zimbabwe, where you definitely hear, in fact, I think sometimes recently some reports showed a whole car stuffed with ballot papers that was nowhere anywhere near a ballot box. So there are a lot of those speculations. Now, I'm not really confident to say how true they are and are they recent, because also sometimes, you know, especially now in the age of social media, sometimes old reports are brought in with the new reports, and it's very difficult even for us as journalists to really determine and decipher what is true today. But there's no question that there's going to be some kind of a challenge depending on what this outcome is, especially if it does not favor the opposition. And of course, as we already said, both ZANU-PF and MDC Alliance are saying we're going to win this race. There's no way we're not. So obviously, and also sometimes even going to the extent of saying they will not accept anything less than an outright victory. So that already, spells out the the process that we're going to be having.
The line has been drawn.
And then there's also that speculation that maybe there might be another unity government in the making. If maybe there's a decision to just, forget, don't even worry about the unity government or a runoff. Why don't we negotiate? So anyway, all that will unfold in the next few weeks.
Well, you are watching Shaka Extra Time, a show only here on Facebook, where we answer your questions and talk about politics in Africa. Shaka and Paul are in Zimbabwe covering the elections, and Ndimyake Mwakalyelye, chief of the Zimbabwe service, is in Shaka Ssali. We have some more questions from our audience. So we begin with David Onserio Monda from New York, asking, do you think the International Criminal Court should initiate proceedings to investigate the unsolved mass murders in Matabeleland during and how complicit is Mnangagwa in those murders?
Well, it's not a question that he has not been directly asked, and some say he has not responded in a way that is, enlightening or really reveals anything more than what people have been speculating. In fact, even when he was at Davos, that question came up. He was interviewed by the BBC. And basically he said that there's a Truth and Reconciliation Commission Act and a bill that is effective, that is looking into those things and trying to address the situation. Does that mean that it's a case closed? Obviously not. Gukura Hundi comes up every other time. Of course, the International Criminal Court, as we all know, works a certain way, where there's either a process through the UN initiating it or a member country initiating it. Zimbabwe is not a member of the ICC. And then also, who would, bring this issue to the table? It's clearly a very contentious issue. I don't know that it necessarily needs the ICC or that Zimbabweans are waiting for the ICC. I really believe that it's one of those conversations that has to be addressed. And I think even though President Mnangagwa has been asked about it several times, President Mugabe himself as well, he always referred to it as a moment of madness, but never really owned up to it. So there's still a lot of questions about what happened, who was responsible. And I think it's just a question of time before a strategy is devised, and I think it will take a lot of the community to really kind of force something. The ICC might be one channel, but I can't say for sure that that's the way to go.
Probably a special court, because the ICC can only handle cases from 2002. Exactly. And then the second question says, how should the next president of Zimbabwe proceed with the appropriation of land from white farmers? Should the program be abandoned? If so, should it happen to millions of landless black? What should happen to the millions of landless black Zimbabweans?
So this issue of land distribution is obviously a controversial issue when it comes to Zimbabwe. Everybody recalls what happened in the 2000s when there was the land takeover, and then the sanctions kicked in, and then the economy tanked, or the Zimbabwe's agricultural base seemed to collapse. It's on the uprise now, especially with the new black farmers who took on the challenge. I don't believe, even among Zimbabweans, that there's any dispute about the fact that redistribution had to happen. It was, I think, always a question of how it happened and the nature and the form that it took, which became almost chaotic, disruptive, and to a point really didn't achieve the end result that many were expecting. So even though the white farmers were kicked out, of course we know now that President Mnangagwa just met with the white farmers just a couple of weeks ago, basically saying that, we want you to be included in this new administration and in the new economy. Even the late vice president, even the late leader of the MDC party, Morgan Tsvangirai, also made lots of reference to how, we have to figure out how we can co-share this thing. The truth of the matter is that, land is power. And, in Africa, in many African countries, Zimbabwe included, it signifies more than just, a plot of land. It's legacy, its ability to own and control your means of sustenance. So I think it's a question of how can this land be distributed equitably? Because even under the land distribution that was done by President Mugabe, there's still a lot of speculation that it did not really come down to the common person, that it's still political. You know, you hear a lot of references to how some ministers had multiple farms. There's so many efforts to do audits so that whoever has more than 3, whoever has more than 1, should be giving the land back, because otherwise it's basically the same thing, only now it's not a white face.
And another question, does Grace Mugabe have a future in Zimbabwe politics? Is she a viable candidate for the next election cycle?
Whoa, now Peter.
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. You know, she clearly rose, through the time. She had been a very quiet figure in the party, not even in the party so much, really, just in the background. And then clearly, towards the end of the new beginning, she became a real, presence in ZANU-PF. And you ask a lot of people, and I don't think that the impression is that she, in fact, as you know, that's one of the reasons why this intervention was staged by the military, that Grace Mugabe had become too powerful, and that President Mugabe no longer seemed to be in control of the party. And then even President Mugabe himself admitted that she was not really a member of the party per se, to even hold the structure and lead the party. Maybe that's why there was this seeming mechanization to get her to be vice president and then put her in line to be maybe a competitor or a contestant within the party. So it's a mixed bag. I talked to a lot of Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe about her. And I can't say that there's this, base for her to run. But then maybe I just didn't talk to everybody.
Before we go, what do you think are the expectations of Zimbabweans following this election? Do they expect their lives to improve or change to the better following, the military intervention or coup or whatever they call it that forced President Robert Mugabe out and ushered in a new era?
You've met many Zimbabweans, right? Including here at Voice of America. And anywhere you find Zimbabweans in the world, they're doing great things. They're either heading something or they're on the top echelons of something. They're progressive, they're driven. And I think that is not reflective on the ground. So for a lot of Zimbabweans, they want the life that they're living outside, they want to live it in Zimbabwe. So I think the expectation is that it will create this base and an opportunity where people can maximize on their potential. Zimbabwe has the record of being the most educated population. And imagine the frustration of having people who are educated, and now, of course, you've seen the pictures and the social media, all sorts of images that have circulated, them in graduation gowns selling tomatoes and, phone cards and stuff like that, because for the most part, that's what many Zimbabweans in Zimbabwe have been reduced to. I mean, and you're not talking just about the young people. You're even talking about the seniors, because of the fact that many who worked for many years, who had worked, even earned their pension, literally dissipated. And now they find themselves depending on their kids or their offspring. And so I think it's a call for Zimbabwe that people can feel they can live the life that they deserve.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you all for joining us on Shaka Extra Time, a show only on Facebook where we answer your questions. Ndimyake Mwakalyelye, Chief of the Zimbabwe Service of VOA, is sitting in for Shaka. Thank you, Ndimi, and thank you for joining us. I'm Peter Clottey. See you next week.
To